Let me start with Aleksandar Matković. Aleksandar Matković is a researcher at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory at the University of Belgrade, and as well a PhD candidate at Scientific Research Center of the Slovenian Academy. He deals mainly with contemporary Marxism and the political economy of fascism. He also deals with the history of Yugoslav self-management and theories of biopolitics. He's a member of the editorial committee of the Encyclopédie Internationale de l'Autogestion and member of the editorial board of the Serbian journal Stvar. Aleksandar, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'm a bit sick, so please excuse me if I cough or something like that. So the topic of my paper would be this discourse on the internal contradictions of liberalism, of capitalism, of fascism. So this notion of a terminal crisis, is that something that I wish to criticize. So to begin, when the Italian poet and anti-fascist Giuseppe Antonio Borghese wrote in 1934 that not a single prophet during more than a century of prophecies has ever imagined anything like fascism, he had struck a chord that would in time impregnate itself onto the field of European political history and beyond. So there was in the lap of future, he says, everything from communism to syndicalism and whatnot. There was anarchism, there was legitimism, but there was no fascism. It came as a surprise to all and to themselves too. What one reads among these lines is one of the most pivotal myths surrounding fascism, crucial to the European left of the 1920s as much as today. Namely that fascism has always been considered a novelty, a foreign edition, a European anti-phenomenon, somehow as if it was created ex nihilo, out of thin air. So it is in fact in this context that we need to familiarize it rather than to alienate it from its European political roots, and what Ischailander called for the attempt to westernize fascism, so to present it in its European light. However, this attempt to westernize fascism is nothing new. In fact, if we look at the recent works of not only Ischailander but also Domenico Losurdo, Gaspar Miklos Tamaš, Tomasz Masnak here, and so on, we can even go back and say that the entire role of the westernization of fascism was in fact played by 20th century Marxism. From the Third International to the dialectic of enlightenment, there are numerous attempts to somehow provide a theoretical background for thinking fascism, of course. However, this theoretical confrontation, as Mladen Dolar put it, was simultaneously a self-reflection of Marxism itself. And it's here that I want to sketch how this westernization of fascism, often resting on an analogical comparison within Western thought, political or economic relations, in fact downplays the conceptual confrontation with both these relations and fascism itself. The problem is, as I will argue, that in both cases it presupposes the notion of a terminal crisis, a predestined end of the ills and ails of capitalism. So, to begin with Landa, his book The Apprentice Sorcerer, the liberal tradition in fascism, begins with a short fable explaining its title, which I will now read. So, I quote, "Liberalism, like the sorcerer's apprentice in the famous story, called into existence forces immensely useful at first, but which it subsequently could not control. These unruly and unkindly multiplying mobs, the modern workers, which refused to accept their role as mere tools in the production process and were gaining lives and wills of their own. So, according to Landa, the liberal apprentice conjures up a sorcerer in order to re-establish order, to retransform the animated brooms into plain wood. Fascism, in spite of words and gestures, came not really to do battle with liberalism, but primarily as an ally, albeit a bully and patronizing one, offering much-needed succor. So, according to Landa, it was liberalism itself that led to the rise of fascism, first as a mob, so to speak, needed to sweep its own internal contradictions, and then as a sorcerer needed to control them. Thus, there is a deep link that runs between German National Socialism and Italian fascism and liberalism itself. And this deep link is the liberal split, the bifurcation within liberalism itself onto the spheres of economy and politics. And a last quotation from Landa is he says that this liberal split is such that it presents an indispensable historical precondition for fascism. That is the inherent tension between the political dimension of the liberal order and its economic one. It is a split running from Fox to Burke to Spiro to Hayek, Mises, and even Milton Friedman, all the way up to the 20th century. However, while the split may have been a precondition for Landa's comparison, it certainly was not a precondition for fascism in what he analyzes within it. By merely drawing analogies between the advocates of liberalism and their Nazi counterparts, Landa's presupposition fails to explain the very thing it was intended to do, the transition from laissez-faire liberalism and parliamentary democracy to the specifically fascist forms of government. So while Landa's move could have had a great explanatory power in other theoretical contexts, his analysis remains limited to what I propose to call analogical forms of thought. And this analogical thought, however, tells us nothing of the categories and the order of things within fascism, nor of their use in other political economic configurations as well. But not only so, it in fact prevents us from approaching them. Since his presupposition of the liberal split is used simply as a retroactively projected starting point, the transition between the two systems seems as if it simply had to happen, as it must have happened simply because it did. So, as in fact what Landa does is presupposing this split as if it was conjured up, not unlike the sorcerer of the fable which it seeks to critique. If this split was, for example, linked with the way it was theorized historically and logically, for example, in Ellen Maxine Swoog, the debates on the origins of capitalism against the theories which reduce fascism to an agent of monopoly capital, it could have had some more explanatory power, but in his own analysis, it does not, unfortunately. So, I think that this is the problem, that herein lies the problem, that the analogical reasoning we see somehow presupposes all these theoretical problems which it cannot escape from, and also is part of Marxist heritage precisely from the critique of the liberal political economy of fascism. If Landa would have followed this split, he would need to go into the political economy of fascism, but the problem is that all of these analogical approaches are also the part of this precisely critique of the political economy of fascism. So, for example, let us recall that even the first analytical weapon that the International had against fascism was an analogy, Marx's 18th Primero of Bonaparte. Long considered a proto-fascist study after August Telheimer laid the foundation for the theories of Bonapartism. However, the background for this, in both Landa and these predecessors that I briefly mentioned, was something else also present in these analogical approaches. This is the idea of the terminal crisis, of a system failing due to its own internal contradiction. In Landa, as in Rethel, as in Köln, as in Hobsbawm, and the Second and Third International, we meet again and again the motive of a crisis developing out of the internal contradictions of liberalism and capitalism, depending on what you are attacking. So, the problem then is how do we interpret these internal contradictions? For example, I might quote Hobsbawm, who reaches the conclusion that even if there was no fascism, the parliaments would have paled by themselves. Well, the most striking example would be, of course, the denial of the Second International and the Third International of the limits of fascism, even in reducing it, as the Italian communist Amadeo Bordiga had done, to a ministerial crisis, to a crisis within the parliament. So, and even if we are to recall what Poulantzas criticized in it, that the International, by invoking this terminal crisis, the idea that the fascism is the last card of the bourgeoisie, it somehow presupposes the death of, or the idea that the capitalist laissez-faire would somehow fail within its own contradictions. And these analogical approaches that I mentioned, which are active today, in fact, in the theories that I mentioned in the beginning, have as their presupposition precisely this notion of a terminal crisis, but interpreted as if it was fated to collapse. What they conceal then is something akin to a concept of destiny, a fatalism, even when it is carried out in terms of political economic analysis. I mean, there is a joke that the left predicted 10 of the last 3 crises. So this is precisely that. The idea that something would simply fail in itself. This was used in the discourses on fascism from what I mentioned in the international up to the very day today. The price for this, however, is, as Polantzas has shown, the dismissal of any notion of subjectivity, of subjective resistance, and the most obvious example, the omitting of a class struggle, recalling, of course, the constantly postponed activation of the working class in the international all the way up to the 1930s in Dimitrov's speech, when it was all but obvious that no internal contradictions would have wiped away any novel political economic configuration that came after the laissez-faire and the Great Depressions. So, in a sense, the critique of this would be that they were quite literally thinking of the crisis, much the same as it is done today. I mean, I won't take much of your time, but we need only to recall some recent examples that are very present in the media. When the Scottish Bank tells us that no housing market will be functioning. Recently, I think 3 days ago, IMF published a paper criticizing neoliberalism. In The Guardian today, you have an article that's entitled "Neoliberalism Will Collapse from Within." So this is in effect something that is not only a media thing, but also a theoretical thing inherent in Landa, Lossurdo, Tamash, and the authors that I mentioned in the beginning. So what they convey to us are accounts of violent tendencies, but concealed within this analogical framework and even fatalist thinking. So in this sense, this is what Polantzas has shown a negation of subjective resistance, present not only from the discourses on fascism, but also today within the theories that somehow presuppose that they could trace tendencies of capitalism by comparing fascism and liberalism and so on. So this is somehow, as far as I see it in the media, some of the theories which I mentioned are pretty stubbornly present thing, to expect that the system would fail on its own accord. So, in this sense, fascism, as well as these theories, still present as conceptual self-reflection of Marxism. And in order to think our neoliberal present in view of the long-term tendencies that they presuppose within the specifically capitalist mode of production, we need to go beyond this fatalist methodology of analogical thought. Only once we do away with it can we turn to the task of confronting the logical historical outcomes of this deep link, this deep rift, what Landa called the liberal split within liberalism itself. And if the aim is to follow the path from this split to the wedlock of competition and violence of the 1920s as much as today, then this begets not a positivist comparison, but the defetishization of economic relations themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aleksandar. You were very expedient. I must say I admire that. I would like to introduce now our next speaker, Marisa Žele. Marisa Žele is a PhD candidate in philosophy at the Postgraduate School of Scientific Research Center of Slovenian Academy in Ljubljana. She graduated in the SAD in 2012 and received her Master's of Arts degree in philosophy with study on the monstrous and the uncanny in 2015. Her main fields of interest are theories of the bizarre, post-structuralism, and philosophy of history. How does that all combine? We will probably have to ask after her talk. Please go ahead, Marisa.
Okay, thank you. I hope you hear me. It's the first time I use this thing. Okay.
Aleksandar, actually, could you help? Yeah, all right.
It's to be like close. Huh. Okay, like that. Okay. I think so. Okay, I'll just jump right into it. So the first idea that comes to mind, to my mind, when thinking. What? Don't hide your Okay. Okay. So the first idea that comes to my mind when thinking of crisis is the status of its recurrence. It appears to occur time after time, again and yet again, after an interval, in a manner of pulsating repetition. It is the state that seems to insist, even when it gets extinguished, or at least when it appears to cease, and yet again camouflages itself into more dissembled form until another reappearance. What I'll try to think in this short intervention of mine is the peculiar relevance of this repetitive character of crisis to our historical contemporaneity. In my current research, I tend to return to the time which, when applied to today's context, could be known as the era of the Great European Crisis. Those were the spectacular Middle Ages, whose eschatological thinking was fundamentally challenged and shaped by constant threat of the apocalypse. Probably most influential text of the time was the prophecy of Saint Methodius of Patara from late 7th century, from which we can gain more details about this cataclysm waiting to happen. In it appear wild apocalyptic nations, bringers of the end, who Alexander the Great locked away from the world to save it from eternal devastation. However, at the end of time, the doors were meant to be broken, and the Antichrist's forces that dwelt behind them for centuries were to be unleashed upon the European soil. It all started with godlike deeds of Alexander the Great when he proceeded to the east. I quote, "He marched round the earth and descended to the east and went as far as the sea called Fire of the Sun. And there he saw nations filthy and ugly to look at. And when he saw the abominable deeds which they were doing, they ate the vermin of the earth, mice and dogs and kittens, and they did not enshroud and bury their dead, and the embryos which the women aborted, they ate as if it were some delicacy. And when Alexander saw their abominable deeds, he called God to his aid. And he assembled and expelled them and their wives and their sons, and he placed them and closed them from the ends of the north. And King Alexander prayed before God, and God commanded the mountains, called Sons of the North, and they drew near each other to a distance of no more than 12 cubits. And Alexander made a gate of brass and anointed it on the inner side with asbestos. It is not affected by iron, not by the demons, not even fire can destroy it." End quote. However, at the very end of times, when the end of the world approaches, the end-time peoples of Gog and Magog and another 22 kings and nations who Alexander imprisoned inside the gates of the north will break out and march upon the world like a plague to harass it and bring it to its end. It was certain for the medieval mind that the end was near and the apocalypse could have happened at any given time. The warning was given to mankind through this prophecy, not only moral but political warning as well. Christians were to follow the holy commandments of their God and finish all his deeds to withstand the last judgment, including spreading of Christianity and maintaining their own morality for the likeness of their God. Considering the medieval framework of a world chronicle, the possibility of finding the right figures who are symptoms of the prophetic prognosis was at high risk. The medieval consciousness was well informed of its end, as well of its own becoming at the beginning of history. There was absolutely no doubt that every beginning leads to its end. However, uncertainty of this burden was still great as it demanded certain preparations which were necessary to be done before the arrival of doomsday. Reading signs was important in order to locate the exact position of one's own presence in the course of history, as it was only a matter of time when the chasm of Alexander would be broken and the border which separated the world would be crossed over. Not surprising, really, that medieval mind located itself at the ultimate stage of the world's existence, which only intensified the striving to bring it back into a final order. The crisis meant standing on the edge. The edge that has formed in Europe was not only temporal, but it had a certain topological dimension which would crucially shape its future character. There was a danger in growing world, and borders, limits, frontiers, and peripheries existed as recurring subjects. Edge was manifested through border, which appeared as a fundamental element of topological character of not only medieval, but also contemporary Europe. The threat was positioned on the other side of the border, which formed the edge with the familiar world. It was there that differentiated from here, and there lived they who weren't us and could pose a threat to our way of being. The exclusion of foreignness demanded the exclusion of world's width. Clear line between inside and outside was requisitive to perpetuate homeliness. This need of categorizing the world gained familiar Europa its political definition, which arose exactly from this eschatological framework. A clear line was drawn between us, the Europeans, and them, the non-Europeans, those who were in and those who were out, and should stay out if we were to exist at all. The prophetic message has been delivered. Crossing the border brings the end. It means the annihilation of the familiar and the destruction of Mother Europe, who let in something that should have stayed safely locked outside. However, insiders were not only threatened from the outside, the inside seemed to be problematic as well. According to Pseudo-Methodios, the impulse from the end would come from within the Christian society, and when the latter would be corrupted by sin and iniquity. Travesty, homosexuality, and prostitution would attract the armies of Muslim invaders and cause suffering of Christians until the rise of the last world emperor, who would come to their aid against their enemies and eradicate them. Although all those gruesome events would have already taken place, the catastrophic scenario was only preparing to unfold. After the victory, the peaceful and all-perfect era was to begin, the era that interestingly would have never existed at all. Or as Pseudo-Methodios has put it, I quote, "Then the earth will sit in peace, and there will be great peace and tranquility upon earth, such as has never been nor ever will be, since is the final peace at the end of time." And right then, in the time that has never been nor it ever will be, at the very end, when it would just seem that everything will be all right, the moment of great serenity would be the one that causes the final catastrophe. The seal on Alexander's doors would suddenly break and unleash the nations who would bring the world to its end. Thus, if we have taken upon ourselves this topological discourse of medieval inside and outside, there could be said that crisis seems to move in both ways. If the outside is threatening, the inside is accumulating crisis as fast as it expects its own disclosure. Another example can be found in writings of Hildegard of Bingen, Benedictine abbess from 11th century, who located the main figure of the apocalypse inside of the known world rather than on its margins. Her portrayal of the Antichrist arising from within the church is interesting as it combines a certain turn when former virtuous woman from one of Hildegard's earlier visions suddenly appears as the grotesque mother who gives birth to the monstrous child. Hence, the whole opens in midst of the known and familiar, and the foreign emerges from within as the other face of holiness. And as the edge presses on the medieval world from the outside, the tension builds from the inside as well. The edges intertwine, but the space between them is marked with emptiness, which derives from constant wandering for the solution. The crisis takes on itself that exact structure. As nothingness awaits in form of the end at the outside, it appears to be empty also in the inside, but fills the opening with expectation. It could be said that emptiness is threatened of dissolving into nothingness, and the very expectation of this nihil end slides into crisis. This expectation of fast approaching end forms the core of medieval crisis. The end is expected, and it will arrive eventually, but the solution of how to successfully await it still stands on uncertain grounds. Crisis emerges from something threatening. It is the middle stage when the next step is not yet defined, or better, when the result is not yet assured. The tension builds through repetitive attempts to discharge the situation. It is the moment of no solution that insists and discloses the subject's place in the world as unwhole. Gog and Magog are the real threat to the medieval world. They present the possibility that a system can fail. However, time of threat is already time of the collapse. Time of medieval speculations of the end is already the time of crisis. Taken out of its medieval context, there could also be a way to think of crisis as a phenomenon in a sense of its function. It produces the subjects of the crisis whose interpolation occurs through the very act of expectation. Expectation of something that has not happened yet, but is already constituting the present that is aspecting as it is headed towards its end. The constant search for a solution and simultaneous confinement in this irremediable situation where the end is inevitable is exactly the expectation which cannot be relieved that produces crisis in its irrepeatable sense. It seems that its recurrence is unseizable as crisis structurally emerges from this tension which insists even when we find ourselves in a discourse of post-crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marisa. And so we come to our third interventionist. Her name is Marta Olesik. Marta, hi. She is a doctoral student at the Polish Academy of Sciences, and she is currently working on her dissertation dealing with the notion of artificiality and developing a structure of abstract sensuality. I hope that I explained this properly. She bases this on Cartesian philosophy, as well as on the works by a French Baroque painter by the name of Georges de la Tour. So, Marta, please go ahead.
Okay, I can't remember the title that I've given to the text, so I'll proceed. In 2010, when the book was published, Frédéric Lordon still claimed that he doubts, quote, passionate viability.
Just lower it.
Maybe I won't need it at all.
No, you need it.
Passionate viability of a social formation that would make the choice, for example, through degrowth, of a voluntary reduction in its population's material aspirations, end of quote. And yet this reduction of material aspirations is precisely what austerity policy advocates and reinforces. In addition, there no longer is such stress on consent, understood in terms of positive affective investment in the work performance, which Lordon could still think of as indispensable. And nevertheless, the social formation which requires this lowering of expectation is still able to generate passionate viability. Thus, the paper will examine the changes in the economy of desire which allowed the regulation policies, after they brought about the current economic crisis and suffered from it in return, to successfully translate into austerity measures. Lordon analyzes the contemporary economy of desire in terms of perfect alignment between the master desire of the system, the global economic structure, and the desire of its participants. The master desire is for reproduction, which, unlike any other reproduction, has an abnormal form of infinite accumulation and growth. It is facilitated by the, quote, liquefaction of the labor power, making the overall size of the workforce into something fluid, reversible, and easily adjustable, end of quote. This liquefaction constitutes the obverse and condition of the perfect alignment of individuals. Though Lordon values the alignment negatively, he still considers it within a quasi-progressive schema, from less to more and ultimately complete alignment. What interests me here is the functioning of this alignment in the conditions of its interruption, the incorporation of particular desire into master desire when the latter suffers from a crisis, the both perplexing and telling case of particular desire for the austerity measures. Since they are now considered as means of relieving the economic crisis, which they helped trigger in the first place, further destabilization and liquefaction are no longer denied to be harsh measures. Interpolation changes. Effective investments, which is still being produced, is obtained by way of creating a demand for urgent protection. A quote from Rodon. But no action is more than a moment in the infinite sequence of the determination of things by things, end of quote. This dependency is no longer kept secret, overshadowed by visions of individual aspirations and self-development. To the contrary, it is ostentatiously disclosed, as global economy in crisis is cast as an endangered nurturing mother. It is being awarded vulnerability strictly related to its relational complexity, which particulars are being renounced for its sake. The totality of economic relations is projected as quasi-embodied because fragile subject of violence. The harshness of the adopted measures is sometimes even stressed in order to enhance the asymmetry of vulnerabilities. Global universality is fragile, easily shatterable, whereas individuals are immune, at least in comparison. A passionate embodiment of experience is realized, yet as a result for the oppressive system at the expense of the particular bodies in their finite relations. Thus, austerity and neoliberal economic policy in times of crisis becomes an ecology of the capital. The stance of concern is not simply an ideological facade, in the sense that universality has indeed proven vulnerable. Yet this vulnerability is the best possible source of immunity. It functions as a vaccine. Infecting the system, it is then reversed into resistance. Though, unlike with other vaccines, the state of immunity does not replace the former vulnerability towards the conditions of crisis, but enhances it. Austerity policies do not stabilize the system, but feed on and precipitate the destabilization. In other words, they preserve the master desire for reproduction in the unchanged form of excessive accumulation. The immunity to the virus is not something resulting from, but opposing to the infection. No, it is the infection itself, with the temporal succession of the two conditions collapsing into the fever of the surplus production. What is becoming immune, nevertheless, is the vulnerability of a particular body. In the royal remains, Eric Zantner defines biopolitical immunity of particular body in the Hobbesian terms, wherein the independence from nature granted by society translates into dependence and vulnerability with regards to this very society. Therefore, demonstrating the condition of particularity dependent on the injection of societal immunity, Zantner still insists on the subjective aspect of this experience. The particular is allowed to suffer from universality, with the suffering defining its ontological status. The particular desire for austerity measures disclose the illusory nature of this diagnosis. Though empirically real, the individual vulnerability is vaccinated, itself and against itself. In consequence, as a part of social fabric, it enjoys a numbness, the reverse of the fabric's complex fragility, whose demand of being sustained and protected requires the subjection of particular energies. The austerity measure discloses the fact that being granted the immunity to nature, the socialized body is at the same time immunized against universality. The latter's relational complexity goes both far beyond and right into the body, liquefying their difference, not destroying it, but making it finer and finer, more destabilized, diversified, and multiplied into destruction. Thus, difference is diverted into the sameness of alignment. Disciplined in fluidity, the body experiences universality as no other. This immunity to difference changes dramatically the structure of alienation, whose classic modern schema is precisely that of estrangement, the separation and objectivization of particular body as the universal other. This separation is now diverted. The relocation of vulnerability onto a universal subject with the exclusion of particularity is the overcoming of the condition of estrangement, which takes it a step further, alienating the alienation itself. This false disalienation is executed through positing particulars in their relation as quasi-organically merged with the fragile, differentiated tissue of universality considered to be constantly endangered. Thus, alienation is not the stability of subject-object structure, but its crisis, which asserts itself as the condition of the surplus reproduction. The moment of systematic inoperativity proves the condition of excessive sameness, sameness parting at the seams, yet not in order to fall apart, but to allow space for more commotion and deregulation, more crisis indeed. Ecology of global capitalism in crisis is an ecology of excess. The surplus production being advocated not in spite of the crisis, but in its name, unashamedly exposing the identity of this seemingly opposite phenomena. In this context, I want to rekindle the Baroque concept of furor, defined by the dramaturgist Lopez Pinciano as, quote, an alienation in which the understanding separates itself from the beaten path, end of quote. This separation, which is the opposite of the subject-object separation, a separation from the subject-object structure, is a response of, I quote Antonio Maraval, the Baroque creator who, in attempting to resolve one of those situations that the 17th century considered to be without precedent, felt thrown out, beside himself, alienated. In such a sense, Baroque culture led human beings to be other than themselves, to go outside the beaten path, and this technique of alienation provided the basis to bring to bear upon such subjects a culture of estrangement, a guided culture. The basis for the Baroque to be a guided culture is revealed in the fact that it was fundamentally a culture of alienation, end of quote. Furor is guided, that is regulated, through its own extremeness, whereby the extremeness on its way out towards regulation is caught in a loop, no other than the extremeness itself. The crisis is being managed by the crisis itself here. The institutions of crown and church unravel, and upon realizing that there is no going back, they salvage themselves by forcefully expressing this condition, transferring it to the particular body. Furor, the transfer of a crisis, dazzles the subject with critical commotion, manifesting itself as the excessive opulence of Baroque culture. This opulence is the reversal of the critical inoperativity of the system, the social mechanism sweating and steaming with its malfunction. The particular body is disintegrated by this experience, which it incorporates, thus relieving the crisis. Relieving the crisis, a discretely contradictory expression, where relieving does not suggest appeasing, but to the contrary, intensifying the crisis, thus relieved, that is allowed autonomy. Furor is the deregulation on the loose, and it makes the particular body swallow it, incorporate its inability to incorporate. The crisis as the outside like no other, the same. Furor is an alienation like no other. Having no other to be alienated from, the decaying order remains omnipresent. An outside with nowhere to go, because without an outside. Austerity policies are also guided by extremes. Their proper name dissimulating the internal tension created by the fact that what is austere here is the excess of accumulation, which will not accept harnessing and therefore has to create diversion. And this diversion is the crisis itself, miraculously translating into relief, a cure by way of autoimmunological disorder. The Baroque saints in ecstasy cover up the unraveling of the system by faithfully translating it into the furious fits of faith. And although the fury commanded by the global economy is immunized, this immunity is to make the body just as feverish as the system is. The required numbness to difference is one where two suggests being forward, numb enough to differ beyond recognition. The autoimmunological disorder makes no difference. It is the vulnerability renounced in favor of global economy. It makes no difference, as it is to be found everywhere. The structure of alienation changing from that of the distance of estrangement to effective alignment. Lordon's insightful analysis demonstrate the alienation to be the universal relational bond, I quote. Thus, to the real etymology of alienation, which declares the presence of something other than the self, alien, alius, Within self-direction, we can add an imaginary etymology, one which would rather hear in alienate the word lien, tie, thus rediscovering in it the infinite chain of the production. Alienation is thus another one of the things that do not exist, but in the paradoxical form of an excess of existence. Being universal, it is everywhere, and if it does not exist, it is as the obverse of an unreachable state of wholeness and perfect self-coincidence of the subject. The concepts of alienation and authentic consent vanish therefore together, leaving nothing but the movements of desire. End of quote. The structure invites the question of representation. The possibility of grasping the relational intricacy of liquefaction, going far beyond the extension of particular bodies and their perceptual abilities. If alienation is an inseparable link, rather than separation, then it pierces the body, allowing no distance and therefore no perception. Therefore, it is widely believed that the excess is non-representable, that is impossible to be grasped and defined in an objective form. The representational order, based on the idea of objective adequacy and structural distance and estrangement between subject and object, is thought to be an ideological tool, a smokescreen masking the excessive nature of the surplus with the semblance of equivalence. My hypothesis is different. I believe that the contemporary diagnosis of consciousness was not flexible enough to transform with the discovery of flexibility, eagerly producing the global network of domination. Mechanisms of subjections are no longer based on a rational projection of equivalence and adequacy, but on the desiring bodies being trained and disciplined in networking, in touch with the universal unconscious. In this context, I propose to stop thinking about representation in terms of mimetic adequacy and take advantage of its abstract nature in order to expose the abstraction of the surplus. The term abstract concreteness, which lost none of its defining potential today, is usually decrypted as, though universality is abstract, it is also concrete because fully operational. This is not correct, however, as it is precisely because of its concreteness that the universal abstraction is abstract, the abstraction being the intricate relational complexity. What is abstract here is the concrete commotion of the surplus production, the numbing and immunizing identity between surplus production and crisis, productivity which is essentially counterproductive. Surplus means basically plus and even more plus, the accumulation doubling itself, adding to the addition, accumulating. And this very mechanism decides that what is actually accumulated is disaster. The abstraction of representation can be thought of as intervening, coming between the sur and its plus, attracting its abstraction and abstracting from the concrete production of social universality. The subject-object relation, when considered as the exhausted and wasted, irreversible reversal of the surplus, can help define its counterproductivity. The objectivity form, if represented as damaged goods of accumulation, allows to catch the liquefaction process in the deed. In short, representation, misaligned and irritating in its inadequacy, can break the spell of numbness, conditioning material resistance to the process of immunization. Thus, objectifying the systematic counterproductivity, representation has a potential of turning it on itself, diverting it into a counter-movement by cutting it off its spontaneity and autonomy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. Thank you to all three speakers, interveners, for their presentations. Let's have now a discussion. So, questions, comments, response. You are, of course, also allowed to respond to each other, and we will start with Tadej.
Thanks, everybody. It was quite impressed with all three presentations that considering the fact that you had really little time to prepare, it was great. So I have a question and 2 remarks. So I have a question for Aleksandar. It's more like a general question. There is a tendency to say that in these times, right now, the right wing kind of poses the right questions, but that doesn't give the right answers. But what do you think? Is it possible to separate it? So is it possible even to say that right wing poses the right questions when it doesn't give the right answers? You know what I'm going to. So because I think in a way Naomi Klein in the issue of climate change, in the book there's I think one of the main titles is "The Right is Right," but what she means by that is that the right senses that the issue of climate change, if we would to try to solve it, would change everything. This is the title of the book, of course. So there is a difference between the right-wingers sensing that something is dangerous to them, or sensing having this kind of the same impression, an objective impression, let's say, about the situation, and posing the right question. So this is my question to you, but I will go on and give a couple of remarks. I think both the Marisa's and Marta's papers, there is let's say a topology of the time of the end times, in a way, of the times just before the end. And I think for Marisa, I have this question, or maybe a remark only. You talked about this necessity of making a division between the inside and the outside. But I think the question would be, where does this necessity come from? Isn't that from let's say the right impression that there is no division, no existing division, so that this necessity of dividing actually tells us that there is nothing to divide, that there is no possible division in this system. And I think this is maybe like a remark to what Heiko and Fabio just said in the morning. I think when you were talking about this shift from the neurotic to perverse structure of dealing with this subjective structure, I think we should go a step further and maybe say that this structure that we're talking about is not neurotic, is not perverse, but it is autoerotic. So this is really not a subjective mechanism, but something that goes for the, it's something that holds for the system as such. So not a subjective structure, but an objective structure of autoerotism that, in a way, circulates in this closed space. This not really closed space, but in the space that has no outside, the space of the end. This is just maybe a comment. And regarding Marta's paper and this mentioning of furor, it just came to my mind that Robert Fowler, I think it was in 2002, used the word Sparwut regarding austerity. But this was, so what would be the difference between Sparwut in 2002 or 2000, before the crisis, and this furor that I think is quite a similar, it has a similar meaning. What changes? This Sparwut would be really a subjective effect of the people in power, just having no problem with austerity and imposing austerity. But in the times of crisis, this austerity, I think, gets a more ambivalent touch to it. So this is my these are my remarks and questions. So,
thank you very much. So please, let's maybe, let's answer in the order of appearance. So go ahead, Aleksandar.
Okay, so thank you, Trocha, for the questions. In fact, I think to answer your question, would it need somehow to designate, the difference from left to right or whatever, very basic stuff. So, maybe I'll be a bit pathetic now, but in fact, if we are to, zoom out and, view what's the difference between the left and the right currently, or whatever, then I suppose it would be how they interpret human suffering, how they interpret suffering, the notion of suffering. So while the right says that it's individual, that salvation can be individual, it says it's something natural, while the left wing, very generally, says that the emancipation could be collective and could be social. So I think if there's any Marxist take on this distinction, it would be precisely the defetishization of social relations. So in the sense, what I'm more concerned with is not that the right poses right questions, but that it poses wrong questions, but it provides somehow the falsely right answers. For example, this would be the migration crisis, that would be the austerity measures and so on, the idea that nationalism would save you, the idea that deporting migrants will save you. And this, I think, can be somehow connected to the topic I was talking about. If we revisit Gaspar Miklos Tamás' essay on post-fascism, he speaks about Orban in Hungary, and precisely this sort of politics which, as he says, reverse the universal citizenship. So the idea that you as a citizen, as a human being, somebody who suffers, can have or are entitled to have some sort of a citizenship with social and economic rights. So by reversing them, it has to go into these fetishized categories, whereby your problem would not be the lack of social or economic parts of citizenship, parts of the social relations as such, but would be concretized into individual migrants, into these foreigners, etc. And I think Mojše Postone has a good essay on this when he says that anti-Semitism, in fact, is not only something that relates to physical Jews, it relates to the time of the Third Reich or whatever, but it is in fact expression of commodification, of commodity fetishization. So in this sense, this logic can function, today as much as the 1930s. And this is, I think, one of the crucial things that would need to be separated or, in fact, attacked if we are to somehow break this public discourse. And I say this because, as far as I see it, at least in the regional left and the European left, there is a very great tendency to populism, to adopt this right-wing populist rhetoric, and the idea, for example, at least in Serbia, at least in this ex-Yugoslav region, that somehow the left would need to go into this postmodern ideological struggles, adopting the answers from the right, such as nationalism, speaking about the church, etc. And this needs to somehow end, I think, because the left has no answers of its own in this sense. So maybe the answer to your question would be precisely this: to break up with this idea of populism, nationalism, etc., and to attack the forms of thought which, in a sense, function only within fetishized relations and what Postone called commodity fetishism. So that's it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Marisa?
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good question because what I tried to show in this presentation was exactly this, that there's no external or internal position because the outside is already the part of the inside. So this division, like if we talk about the need of it, it's completely phantasmatic. It could be that it arrives from, it emerges from the need to establish oneself, to establish your own place. However, if we follow the medieval model, we can see that when the foreign arrives, when the outsider comes, it has our own face. This is what I tried to show here. It was exactly that when the end happens, it happens here. When we talk about crisis, it is located in a subject. It does not come from some eternal source.
Okay, thank you very much.
Very short.
Marta?
Okay, so what I would say changed is that we no longer have this avant-garde of austerity, but we all bought into this ideology, knowing that it's actually not leading us anywhere. And this is what, and this is why I asked you in the morning about this value form and how it's been actually shunned by economy in times of crisis. That we are actually kind of aware that these policies lead us anywhere, but we still are mystified by them, but in the sense that Adorno says in Dialectics of Enlightenment that we are mystified by the truth. Austerity is not something which should be, and crisis is not something which should be hidden from our sight in order for us to toe the line and work longer hours with less and less security and less wages. No, we are actually told that to our faces, and the state of crisis is exposed in such a way that it is manipulated to force us into. So the truth is being manipulated by being just shoved in our faces, and we feel that we buy into it. This is, I guess, what changed and what I was trying to underline.
Okay, thank you. We still have a good 10 minutes for discussion
today.
today.
No, it's just like, I think there is one point that I think that this truth is invented, all over again. It's continuously presented as invented. When they say, I just thought, you're talking about what we could do, what we should do, blah blah. And I tell you, there is one simple solution: we cannot spend more than we earn. So, and the way that it is presented is, I think, the clue to the core of the problem.
Yeah, but I also think that the shift of vulnerability because we are said that we can suffer more and more because economy is dying. So, hello, who is the body subject here? It's not us. It's the system that functions like that.
It is, of course, from the woman in a £1 million hat that comes the idea that we should not live outside of our means. So, we have a good 10 minutes of discussion. Are there questions from our side? Then let's please go ahead and let's open floor. There are 2 microphones in the back, so we can have even 2 questions at the same time, which I hope will not happen. Let's keep to the raising the hands and...
Basically, first of all, congratulations to you all, because I think all 3 presentations were really very interesting, very different, very in a way, very also deep in their insights. I would just like some sort of clarification from Martha, whether I understood you correctly or not. So basically, furor, did you, in a way, I simplify things, define it as some sort of crisis which was basically artificially made in order to as a supposed answer to some sort of crisis? And am I correct if I understood this juncture both elements of furor on one side and austerity politics on the other side. That there is on both sides that there is this on one hand furor as some sort of artificial crisis which is supposed to answer the crisis itself, and on the other hand you said that austerity politics, in austerity politics there is some sort of diversion which is the crisis itself. So is something about this, is there some sort of artificial moment in both these categories that in a way joins them together? Or can you please maybe specify it in a slightly simpler way where this juncture actually lies between furor and austerity politics?
Thank you.
Furor is a Baroque ideological policy which was invented when the global awareness of 17th century being a time of crisis was like, it was something pretty global, when it's not that it was a secret hidden in the chambers and nobody realized what is going on. So basically from all the letters of complaints to the monarchs and to the church and so on, we can see that it was actually something widely acknowledged. And furor was an ideological policy which it was mainly the stage policy and also how the public holidays were organized. So the idea was to create as much commotion and opulence as possible. And the way I see it, it's not the opulence, because it's usually said that the opulence was supposed to like block the subjective consciousness of crisis. I think it's not the case because of the like widespread acknowledgement of the crisis being unsurpassable, of the crisis of the church and of the crown being unsurpassable. I think that the church and crown's policies were actually, they realized the fact that the crisis is unsurpassable and it is acknowledged as such. So they managed to maintain the status quo by exposing this critical commotion to the public and, like Pinciano says, taking the public off the beaten path. So the immersion and the imposition of the situation of crisis in ideological translation was not meant to stabilize the status quo, but to throw the subject off the rails so that it cannot think of any countermeasures to react to the crisis, but simply go with the flow. This is the parallel I see with the austerity measures. I can see that you see what I'm getting at. So.
Thank you.
What I was criticizing precisely in my lecture was these approaches within different theories. I mean, obviously I didn't have so much time to go within the details, but there are different theories which trace this comparison between liberalism and fascism. So this is Michel Landa, Domenico Lassurdo, Gaspar Miklos Tamashin, and so on. And what I'm actually very surprised to see within these theories is that they somehow circumscribe the 20th century experience, you know, with this idea that a system, or that we at least as subjects of resistance in any given system should somehow leisurely expect it to collapse from its own contradiction. And that is the narrative of the Second and the Third International, which Blantz has criticized, and so on. I can give also an interesting example of Friedrich Pollock, for example, and the debates within the Frankfurt schools, where they, at least he, believed that there is no crisis in fascism, that fascism cannot be prone to crisis, that it can last. So this is an interesting point of view. I mean, obviously he was rebuked and debated and so on. But his idea that by reaching full employment, by reaching, some of the economic goals that capitalism itself could not have reached, that it went beyond the point of crisis. So no trade cycles, no shifts within unemployment, no known causes of crisis. And of course this is also an illogical thought, which I criticized because it presupposes this liberalism as this background against which you have this better system. Of course, it was not better. The full employment, for example, this he does not mention, was based, of course, on structural racism, the division of labor based on racism. For example, if you have Sergio Bologna, who talked about the welfare state being transformed into this system of division of population, the populace. So this is, in a sense, one side of the problem. But if I understood your question correctly, you wish to question whether this critique can be carried out without this total dismissal of the contradictions of the system. So I would argue that, in fact, not. So the problem is not whether there are the inherent contradictions to the system, whether they would lead to its collapse or not. The problem is how we interpret this. So if we interpret it as a fate, as a destiny, so even in economic analysis, which I of course could not mention, I have the feeling that despite all the very concrete economic data, I have a feeling that we're dealing with the concept of destiny here, as if the system was fated to collapse, and this is also the narrative, the Third International and so on, but also with some of the people writing this. For example, the IMF paper which I mentioned, this is the idea that okay, this system did not deliver growth, so it will collapse on its own. Of course it won't. So the neoliberalism, as much as fascism, as much as any other system, regardless of whether it started as a state of exception. So we could remember Philip Mirovsky and this idea that neoliberalism needs the crisis. So although it needs it, it can last. And this is the final point. And how we interpret this is, this should be on the side of the subject and not inscription of fate within the system itself. So,
thank you. So I am given the instruction that this should be enough. So unless there is a really urgent question, I would like to say one thing before I thank the speakers, which is that exactly at 6 o'clock we will have the invasion of the Center for the Wild Analysis directly from Denmark, hosted by our own Aleš Bunta. So please come back at 6 o'clock for this final event of the day. And now we really have to thank Aleksandar Matković, Marisa Žele and Marta Olesik for their wonderful presentations. Thank you very much.